Alright, I'm going to go ahead and continue my commentary on this book right here. If you will remember in the last video, I was talking about the 3 different types of prophets. Well, the thing is, when you're talking about Jesus, you can't classify him as a particular type of prophet because he embodies the characteristics of all 3 different types of prophets. He had direct communication with God. He was functionally literate. He knew the Torah. And number 3, he performed signs and wonders. So he embodied characteristics of all 3 different types of prophets. And that's the first thing you need to know. Now, I'm going to start filling in some extra puzzle pieces to give you a better picture of what was going on in Jerusalem and in Galilee back in the 1st century. Now then, Jesus was a Galilean from Nazareth. He was the son of a carpenter. He was literate, but a lot of his friends weren't. And even if they were literate, not everybody had a copy of the Torah. Why is that? Because they didn't print them like this. You didn't have books like this. This came much later. What you had was papyrus scrolls. And the papyrus scrolls would have the Torah written on it. Now, there were some other things they didn't have. They didn't have dry ice. They didn't have vacuum-sealed chambers to keep those scrolls safe. So, even if you owned the scrolls, eventually they'd wear out. And these people were not exactly the richest people in the world. A lot of those Galileans were very, very impoverished. And that is a problem in itself, and I'll get into that a little bit later. So, you've got a lot of impoverished Galileans. Half of them are literate. Even the ones that are literate do not have access to scrolls. So you got some problems here. Now, you had 3 different types of groups coming in. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes. I mentioned those in previous videos. Alright, so because half of these Galileans couldn't read, and even if they could, they didn't have exactly a bunch of Torahs available to them for ready reading, it was really difficult for them to argue with the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the Essenes. Now keep in mind, the Pharisees had one interpretation of the Torah, the Sadducees had another interpretation of the Torah, and the Essenes had yet another version of the Torah. Oops. Now you can kind of see why Jesus showed up on the scene, to correct all those versions. Now then, what did it mean to actually be Jewish? Now this is where Dante Ting will come in. He's going to start watching this, and I'm sure he will. I'm sure he's going to continue saying, I'm wrong, I'm wrong, I'm wrong. Okay. When you're born Jewish, there are things that accompany being Jewish that don't accompany anything else. Remember, you have a knowledge of the Torah when you're Jewish. That's just a guarantee. The Egyptians didn't have that knowledge. Some Egyptians did. A lot of them didn't. Some didn't even know that Torah existed. And that's because their society was a pagan society. It's the same thing with the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and even the Philistines. They didn't have Torahs running amok. And if they did, half of them couldn't read them anyway, so there you go. So you were very much acquainted with the Torah because of the fact you were Jewish. That was the first distinction. The second distinction was that as a Jewish person, you were given a birthright. It was a land birthright. Boom. You got to live on this plot of land because you were Jewish. Now here comes the problem. A lot of Jewish people thought that just because they were living on that land that very day, that because of their birthright, they were going to live in that land in the afterlife. That's an erroneous teaching. Because even in the times of Moses, Moses clearly said, as long as you abide by my commandments, you will live in this land and prosper. what if you weren't living by the commandments? Well, the ones who were smart knew that in the Torah they had an atonement program. If you couldn't abide by the commandments, you could atone for your crimes. You went to the temple, you made your atonements, so on and so forth. But if you didn't make your atonements at the temple, you lost your birthright. You see, being Jewish in the 1st century AD was not the same thing as being Jewish in the afterlife. To be qualified as Jewish in the afterlife, you had to pass the test of the 10 Commandments. Or otherwise, you didn't live in Jerusalem in the afterlife. That was the way it worked. But some people thought that, well, we're in the land now, and God will make sure we're in that same land in the afterlife. Not really. They'd have known their Torah a little bit better. They would have known that. Okay? Now you say, well, where's my proof of this? Well, Achan was a Jew. Yep. He also stole a Babylonian garment and a few other things from Jericho when he was specifically forbidden by God to do so. Well, when the Jewish people stoned him, well, there went his birthright. I guarantee you will not find Achan in the New Jerusalem. It won't happen. He's not going to be there. Neither is Absalom. Absalom was cursed. Okay? Cursed is the man who hangs from a tree. Absalom got his hair caught up in the tree, and they threw 3 spears into him. He's not going to be in the New Jerusalem. That's what David was so upset about. He didn't just lose his son in this life, but he also lost his son in the afterlife too. And that was bad. David knew this. So you see, just because you were Jewish in that day doesn't necessarily mean that guaranteed you a quick trip to the New Jerusalem in the afterlife. That was an erroneous teaching. Now, let me show you another problem that was coming up in 1st century Galilee. Here you had all these impoverished people. They were already being oppressed by Rome. Now they were being oppressed by the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. Okay? And now they couldn't afford to pay their tithes so that they could make their atonements for the sins they were committing from the Torah. You see a problem with that? They felt they were doomed to not get into the New Jerusalem in the afterlife. And that was a problem. That's why Jesus had to show up on the scene. Finally, Jesus was coming up to the Pharisees and saying, you know all these Galileans, how you're telling them they're so full of sin that they'll never make it in the New Jerusalem? Well, guess what? Their problem is not their sins. Their problem is your teaching. Your teaching is so bad that it's causing them to be in that situation in the first place. And we're going to correct all that so that we don't have tons and tons of Jewish people being condemned in the afterlife when they really did not they didn't do that much wrong. You're the ones getting them thrown into the fiery furnaces. He was putting the innocent blood of the Galileans on the Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes because they did a poor job of interpreting the Torah. Now then, let's take this one step further. A lot of people thought that these Galileans were impoverished because of all the sins they were committing. Well, that's got to be an image problem too. Well, certainly these Jewish people didn't want anybody to see them as impoverished because that puts a bad reputation on God. You see, who's going to believe in a God that leaves his people impoverished? See what I mean? So, some of these people actually, in desperation, because they really wanted to pay those temple tithes so that they could atone for their sins and clean things up with God, clean the books out with God. So they actually became bandits to try to get the money that they needed to pay the temple taxes so they could clean their act up. So their greed came from desperation. These impoverished Jewish people were so desperate to try to clear their name with God, they actually turned out to be bandits in an attempt to clear their name with God. That's definitely not the way God wanted it solved. Well, finally, Jesus came on the scene and said, look, we're not going to have this anymore. I'm going to become their final atonement, and they're not going to have to worry about this anymore. Well, of course, the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes, they didn't like this too much, because that was going to put them out of business real quick. And that's why they got mad at Jesus. Now, I may have not said everything exactly the right way, but I think you're finally getting the idea here. The idea is that these Galileans were very much misinformed. Their poverty was not exactly a sign of their sins. In some cases it was, but not always. A lot of times it wasn't. It was a sign of the sins of the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, and their oppression of the Galileans. And Jesus did not want to lose any of these Galileans, because he felt that the Galileans that were impoverished were more loyal to him than the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. So basically what Jesus was saying was the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes were sinning egregiously, and it was more likely that they were not going to see the kingdom of heaven than the Galileans. Well, this was a personal insult to them. See what I mean? So, just because you were a Jewish person and you got a plot of land in the 1st century AD, that did not necessarily mean that you were going to get that in the afterlife. The only way you got it in the afterlife was either you followed the 10 Commandments 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, or you admitted that you couldn't do it and that Jesus had to take your place because you knew you couldn't do it. And that's what the New Testament is all about. And the New Testament is basically this. You're saying, as a Christian, that you are humanly incapable of keeping the 10 Commandments 24/7. And you are ever so much thankful that Jesus was able to do that for you. He did it perfectly. He was the ultimate Jewish role model. And although we try to emulate what Jesus did, we all know that there's no way we could possibly do what he did. We admit that we are full of shortcomings, okay? And that there's no way we're going to successfully emulate Jesus. Jesus was the only person who could keep those 10 Commandments 24/7. And that's what we're admitting to. And that's what a lot of Jewish converts do today. When they convert to Christianity, all they're saying is, we still believe in the Torah, but we now believe that Jesus was the only one who could keep those commandments 24/7. We couldn't do it. We admit we failed and he succeeded. And that's why we bow our knees to him. We bow our knees to Jesus because we know that there's no way we can keep those 10 commandments, but he can. We fail, he succeeded. It's his blood that was worthy enough to atone for us. I honestly believe, and I'm sure somebody will correct me on this, I honestly believe that the moment Jesus died, he went into the realm of spirits, where all the spirits of all the people, all the Jewish people who had died before Jesus, okay, he went into that spirit world and he spread the gospel to them for the very first time. And those that believed will be in the New Jerusalem. Because remember, Jesus had to spread the gospel to everybody. The only way he could do that was to do that in the bowels of the earth where the spirits of the Jewish people had died. And that's what he did. They were the first people to receive the gospel. Did you ever hear the part where it says the dead in Christ shall rise first, and those that remain will be brought up afterwards? That's the same thing as what I'm talking about. And hopefully you people are getting the right message here. I know this commentary was a little long. I'm sorry about that. Hopefully it'll help you get some of the concepts that I'm trying to tell you. Now that you people have some of the bigger details, you finally get the understanding of what was going on. The most important detail is to understand no Jewish person at that time wanted to disgrace God by appearing impoverished. So out of desperation, which led to greed, they went out and became bandits, and that's something Jesus didn't want. So when Jesus showed up on the scene, he corrected the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and the Essenes, and finally people knew what was really going on. If you want to bless people, even Jewish people, help them learn how to read, how to write, how to think for themselves, and teach them a correct version of the gospel. And more importantly, get them to understand Jesus was the ultimate Jew. He really was. He was a role model for every Jewish people on the planet. Christianity is nothing more than the Torah plus Jesus. That's all it is. When we read the Bible, we read the same Bible that the Jewish people read, except we now believe that Jesus was the ultimate Jew and we could never live up to his standards. That's it. That's all there is. Christianity is nothing more than the Torah plus Jesus. End of story. So we are to definitely love our Jewish brothers and sisters. The way it works. Alright. I've bored you to death now. I will tell you more in a future video. Stay tuned.